Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, as you know that in our previous session we discussed on research methodology. We tried to understand about what research is and try to understand, we understood what are the basic concepts of research. Friends, taking our series forward on research methodology, today we are going to talk on research design. We are going to understand what research design is and how designing is done for the research. For the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Rajan Kumar. Dr. Rajan Kumar is Associate Professor in the School of International Studies, JNU. Friends, if you wish to ask questions from Dr. Rajan Kumar on today's topic, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800110430. I repeat, our number is 1800110430. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Rajan Kumar, and would request him to explain us in detail what research design is. Hello, sir.
Thank you so much, Gitka, and good afternoon, my friends. And today I thought, I should be talking about the types of research, and then that will be followed by types of research design, and I'll let you know how to design your own research, because you're a student of social science and many times you don't know how to proceed in the research. So I thought this one of the first steps of starting the process would be to understand what is research design and what kind of research you should do or you should start with when you think of doing research. So in today's lecture I'll be focusing on type of research, and that will be followed by types of research design, and that will be followed by some of the features, the important features of scientific research. After that, I'll talk about how to improve the research, the existing researches. For instance, every research will have some components like theory, data, and data analysis, and of course the research question. So today I'll explain how to improve the research question, how to improve the theory, how to improve the data collection method, and how to improve the data quality and data analysis. So that will be the focus of my research today. In the process, I'll also talk a little bit about hypothesis. What is hypothesis and how do you frame the hypothesis? So if you are thinking of doing research at a higher level, in the sense of if you are part of MA program or MPhil and PhD program, you must be thinking of thinking of doing some research or starting to do some research on a particular topic. Now the point is, if you have some research question in mind, how do you frame the question? How do you frame the critical question? And one of the important features of any social science research is to frame critical question. So how do you frame the critical question? So I'll come to that, but before that, let me tell you what are the types of researches which are done in the social sciences. First, and the basic research, the most important part of any research would be exploratory kind of research, where the idea is to get insight into the topic. You may not have the great details when you start thinking, or when you start initially. This is the initial step of doing the research, where you start exploring some of the data or some of the writings which are already there in the literature. So that is part of exploratory research. And some of the people do pilot studies for that. Some of the people also do some focus group discussion on that. So that you get some insight into the topic that you plan to do, and that might lead you to that might help you in formulating the right kind of question. That also might help you in formulating the right kind of hypothesis. And also you might want to change your research question or theory after the exploratory research that you have started. So this is the initial step of doing the research, where you begin with some kind of exploratory research. And basically, exploratory researches are done when you do not have many researches which have already been done on that particular topic or that particular theme. So that would constitute the exploratory research. But most of the times, when you think of a topic, you already know that there are certain researches which have already been done by the previous scholars, and a review of literature is already available. You have to review the literature which is already available. So in that case, what most likely you will follow, the method that you will follow, or the type of research that you must be planning to do, it will fall into one of the categories, where that would be either descriptive method or explanatory research. Descriptive, when you answer the question what is happening. For instance, if you want to understand, say French Revolution. So what is French Revolution, and what are the features of French Revolution? So when you're answering the question, what is happening, so that might give you the answer or when you want to answer that kind of question, so that you basically want to give the details of that particular event. But when you go into explanatory kind of research, then you are moving into some kind of finding the causality, trying to find out what are the causes and what are the impacts of those causes and how they are correlated, how the independent variable is correlated with the dependent variable. So that's the purpose of explanatory research. Then the purpose there is to explain, not just describe. Although please remember that even in explanatory kind of research, when you try to explain something, description is an essential part of any research, and it helps you in finding it helps you in explaining things. But it's possible that there are certain researches which are very descriptive in nature and not necessarily explanatory. And explanatory research, or when you want to find the causes of a particular event, so that is much more complex than the descriptive research. In descriptive research, you give the basic outline, basic contours, basic details of the event. But when you try to explain, then you have to explain with the help of finding out the causes, or one cause or the number of causes to explain that particular event. Now let me give you an idea of what are the types of research design in social science. One could be theoretical research, where some of the people they also divide it into experimental research, and the second would be statistical research. Statistical is also known as quantitative research. And the second one would be comparative research. Third is historical, if you're from history background, or even if you are not from history background, if you think that the history is important, history played a very important role in certain events, so then historical research might be very useful for you. You can also do case study, where you go into in-depth analysis of that particular case, you go into the detail of that case. So you might adopt the case study method. Some of the researches are applied researches, when applied, or sometimes is action-oriented research, when the purpose is not just to do research for the sake of research, but the purpose is also to have to apply the knowledge that you gain from the research for the actual population or actual the target group that you have. For instance, if somebody is from medical sciences, or somebody is from biological sciences, if somebody has developed the drug of the medicine for cancer, so that person would be applying that medicine on the larger sample of population. So you have certain researches which are applied in nature, which basically you apply that researches to the population. And mixed method is another method which has become very popular in today's context in most of the social sciences, where you do not necessarily follow one particular method, because that every method has certain advantages and certain disadvantages. So in that context, what you do, that you kind of apply one or two methods or multiple methods. So that is known as mixed method. You will see that some of the people who do theoretical research, they combine the theoretical research with the case study method. Sometimes the statistical method is combined with the case study method. Sometimes comparative study you do, and then that is also supported by some statistical method. So people apply a number of methods or number of research designs for the researchers in social science. Now the important question, that the most important thing that you have to keep in mind, that your what design do you follow, that should be determined by number one, the discipline that you come from, number two, the research question that you have in mind, and third, the kind of research training that you have, the kind of methodological training that you have. So all of that should determine what kind of research design you should apply. For instance, if you're planning to apply quantitative method to measure the social movements in Africa, so in that case, it's possible that you can apply either qualitative method or quantitative method. But if you do not have any training in statistics, so in that case, my suggestion would be to go for the qualitative research, or go for the case study research, or maybe historical research. But if you have training in the quantitative method, so it's possible that you might want to collect the data and then measure the data in quantitative terms, in numerical terms, and then you use statistical analysis to analyze the data. So please remember that there is no fixed method of research for all the kind of researches. Your research question, your training, your discipline, that should determine what kind of research design you should adopt. But by and large, the several designs that I told you just now, so they are the broader research designs applied for in social sciences. Although experimental method is much more popular in either in natural sciences or sometimes in psychology or in biology, but not very popular in social sciences for the simple reason that in experimental method you have two set of this sample. In one sample you have you control the behavior of the person or the animal or whatever objects you apply. In other set you basically you do not control the behavior. So then you try to compare that whether the application of how one particular variable is having the impact on the other. For instance, if you want to test that the impact of fertilizer on the productivity, so what you do that you have two plots. In the two plots, you'll in one plot you will control all the variables that might be having an impact on productivity. For instance, you know that productivity is impacted by say for instance the temperature, rainwater, the quality of seed, fertilizer, etc. But since you want to check the impact of fertilizer on productivity, so what you will do that in one plot you will control the rainwater, you control the temperature, you control the seed quality, and then increase the amount of fertilizer. In the second plot, you will not control you will not apply the fertilizer, and you will just let it free. So you have two samples here, and then you can actually know that whether productivity is increasing in one plot or not with the application of when you use the fertilizer for a certain plot. So control is labs when the scientists do researches in lab, when you want to have, say for instance, the impact of certain drug on cancer. So what they do that they'll have two set of people. On one set of people they'll apply the medicine that they have developed for cancer. In the second set of people they will not apply the medicine, and they'll just give some kind of sweet medicine which is not actually medicine, but that sugar coated medicine by which you want to ensure that the person in the other group also the person is blinded in the sense that he does not know that the medicine is not being given. So through that doctor or anybody, the scientist is trying to control the behavioral aspect of the group. So there are several ways you can design your experiment, but experimental design would be much more relevant if you are in psychology probably, or if you are into sciences. If you are from political science background, if you are from international politics background, so in that case it may be a little difficult to have the experimental design. How do you control, for instance, the French Revolution? How do you control the Bolshevik Revolution? How do you control the Indian independence movement? So these are they are very unique events, and you cannot replicate. And even if you try to analyze through the counterfactuals, it's not possible to have the counterfactuals in the cases that we study in social science. So experimental method is in economics some of the people do apply a method, but otherwise is used much more in natural sciences than it is used in social science. Statistical method, yes, statistical method is applicable, and now even in political science or international politics, sociology, sometimes in anthropology also. So people apply statistical method. So what you have to remember that that should be determined by the kind of data that you're going to collect, and once you've collected the data you should be trained to analyze the data, which means that you should have some training in a statistical method, and you should also have some training in some of the softwares like people use Stata or people use SPSS. So you should have some knowledge of the stats as well as the statistical software to analyze the data, and of course then your data should be quantitative. A comparative method, if you are planning to compare, say, two units or two set of cases or a number of cases you plan to compare, so in that case comparative method could be useful. For example, I want to study the impact of ethnicity on violence, or how ethnic mobilization in a particular state or particular region is leading to some kind of protest and violence in that society. So if you want to check that impact, it's possible that you pick up the case from one from India, one from Russia, one from Sri Lanka, one from Africa. So it's possible that you want to compare the cases, and through comparison you get to know it helps you in understanding the causes of that particular event. And comparative method is very, very popular in social science, and that is used to understand how. And there are two ways you can compare. One is the variable-oriented comparison, and second is the case-oriented comparison. In the variable-oriented comparison, you compare the set of variables that you have chosen to analyze the particular event. For instance, if you want to analyze ethnicity through, say, the religion or language or mobilization of the people or the economic deprivation. So these are the variables that you'll use to compare the cases that you have in a number of regions. For instance, you take the case of Kashmir, you take the case of northeastern states, then you might take the case of Sri Lanka, the Tamil issue. You might take the case of Ireland, and where you have the ethnic issue. You might take the case of Quebec in Canada. So, but you'll be comparing these variables across the cases. So that's variable-oriented cases, a variable-oriented comparison. But sometimes you also compare the case itself. If you're trying to say, for instance, you have the welfare economic model or welfare state model in Scandinavian countries. So what you do that you could try to compare the policies of various states in that broader Scandinavian region. So either you compare the variables or you compare the cases. The idea is to get new insights into different cases. Idea is to get new hypotheses. Idea is to get new causation or new factors which might explain the causes in particular case. So the idea is basically to find the causes through comparison. So you have to give the justification that when you are trying to compare the two cases. Unit homogeneity is an important aspect of this comparison. When you're trying to compare two or number of cases, your unit should be similar. In very simple words, you should not be comparing apple with the orange. So the principle of incommensurability applies here, where when you're trying to compare, the comparative unit should be similar. For instance, if you are picking up the case of Kashmir for ethnicity, the example that I gave you just now, in the case of if you're trying to pick up the case of Kashmir, so you should be comparing the case of say the Chechnya, for instance, in Russia, or the Tamil issue in Sri Lanka, but you cannot be comparing with the entire state of Russia. You cannot be comparing with the entire state of Sri Lanka. You have to pick up the cases which are identical, which are similar in nature. So that is an important assumption that you have to follow if you are planning to comparative study. And many times, students just compare. Basically, what they do that they compare the case Constitution of India with Constitution of South Africa, Constitution of India with Constitution of Russia. But I've seen many times they are very descriptive. They are not very clear that what is the purpose of that comparison. So that justification of comparison, academic justification of comparison is necessary. Some theoretical justification has to be there when you try to compare two or more cases. A historical study, then when you try to follow historical method. So then, when your subject is historical, or when you feel that that historical method can provide some useful insights. So even if your subject is not historical, then you can follow a method which is historical. For instance, when I want to analyze the contemporary foreign policy of Russia, so in that case, the understanding the history or historical method can provide me very useful insights. For instance, what I'll do that I'll also try to understand the foreign policy of the Soviet Union, which Soviet Union disintegrated, and a historical case, as you know now. So what I'll do that I'll try to understand the legacies of Soviet Union on the contemporary policies of the Russia. So that way, history is a very useful way of analyzing or understanding a certain issue. And the entire nationalism, if you want to understand the nationalism of any country, you cannot understand nationalism of any country without going into the history, culture, tradition of that particular country. So historical method is very, very important method. But again, that should be determined by your understanding of the history or your training in that particular discipline. It's entirely possible that even if you're from one discipline, you can borrow the method from other discipline, and that is considered an important contribution to the field of research. Case study. If you're interested in just one particular case, for instance, if you're interested in the understanding the tribal behavior of Andaman and Nicobar states of India. So what you can do is that you have to go to the field. you have to try to observe that tribal population from very close quarters, and there's a concept called participant observation. So where you're trying to observe not from an outsider perspective, but you're trying to observe from insider's perspective. So you'll try to understand the subjectivity or the intersubjectivity, the way the tribal people in Andaman are interacting with each other, the kind of messages that they're using, the kind of language that they use, the kind of symbols they use, the kind of behavior they display when they interact with each other. So that is a very in-depth study of particular case. So that again, if you are coming from business background, so many people study the case of Tatas, the case of Birlas, the case of Ambanis, or the case of one particular unit, how a certain industrial unit are doing better than why certain industrial unit is doing better than the other unit. So you can also study one particular industrial unit, or if you can understand the organization, one particular organization. So in that kind of research, the case study research would be very useful. Applied research, as I told you, that when you have a research where either in terms of policy implications, or we want to apply your research to certain population, so then you have this applied research. Many of the NGOs, for instance, the civil society organizations, they are interested in action-oriented research, because their idea is not to just generate knowledge, but also to use that knowledge for the welfare of the people. So for that kind of research, this applied research or the action-oriented research would be useful. So you gather the information and then apply the information on the population for some positive goals or for some social goals. Mixed method I already discussed, so I'm not repeating that. Now, broadly, what are the features of scientific research? Here, the purpose of any research is to basically to understand the world in a very simple format, and the idea here is to understand the complexity of the world in a very simplified format, and also to present the same research to an audience who can understand your research. So please remember, you can do that through descriptive or causal inferences. The procedure of your research should be open and accessible, where you should actually let people know that what procedure you have followed. So that should be accessible to other people. And please remember that your conclusions, the conclusion or the inferences that you make from your research, are always uncertain, and because all the researches are probabilistic, and most of the theories, as you know, that most of the theories are valid for a certain period of time, they are not valid forever. So your conclusions are always uncertain. It does not mean that that you should not do this. So what I'm trying to tell you, that your conclusions are always probabilistic. Your conclusions are uncertain in the sense that no matter how smart a researcher you are, how much of data you have collected, how much training you have got in research analysis, your research can never portray the exact complex reality. Your idea is to make sense of the reality, not to project the complete complex reality. So that's the reason I'm telling you that your conclusions are always uncertain. Science is the method. Here, if you're doing empirical research, so here, whether you in social sciences or natural sciences or the other, or any scientific research, is the content, the major thing that unifies the scientific research is the method. When you follow a scientific method, there are certain steps, there are certain procedure that you need to follow if you want to follow the scientific research. Now, broadly, at the moment anybody tells you to do any kind of research, three things that you should keep in mind. First is the research question. You cannot do any research without a research question. You have to have some problem in mind, some idea in mind that is bothering you to know that, and where you want to do some research. So research question is the first important thing that you should have in mind. The second, if you are interested in social sciences especially, or even in natural sciences, many of the researches are theoretical in nature. So your theory or broader generalization is again important part of the second of your research. But if you are planning to do case study, in that case theory may not be that necessary, and you may not use theory in that case. But critical question is the data and data analysis. Please remember three things. Any research you want to do, first you have to ask, what research question I need to frame. And I'll tell you how to frame the proper research question here in today's lecture. So research question, data, and data analysis. You should ask yourself what kind of research question I need to frame to answer the problems that are there in your mind. Second, you should ask yourself what kind of data do I need to answer those research questions. What kind of data will you collect, and how can you collect the data? So the data, where will you get the data? How do you collect the data, and how do you analyze the data? So these three things are very important part of any research. So remember three things: that first is the research question, second is the data, and third is data analysis. Without that, you cannot do any empirical research. These are the integral part of any scientific research. And please remember that for the moment you are asked to do research, or the moment you plan to do research, these three things you have to work upon, and without this you cannot do any scientific research. And I'll also tell you how to improve the research question. I'll tell you how to improve the theory, how to improve the data, quality of data, and I'll tell you how to improve the data analysis. But the four things are integral to any research, and you cannot proceed for research without these four things that I just told you. So with this, I stop this part here. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us this productive session. Friends, we will be meeting again after a very short break, so you are requested to be with us. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back in this part of the lecture where we are going to discuss more and more on research design, and to give us in-depth knowledge on the topic we have with us in our studios Dr. Rajan Kumar. Friends, if you wish to ask questions on the following topic from Dr. Rajan Kumar, do call us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1-800-110-430. Now I would like to welcome our guest Dr. Rajan Kumar once again and would request him to continue further.
Thank you, Geetika. And in this part, I'll be talking about how to improve the research design itself. So research design here, I'll talk about how to improve the research question. Then I'll come to how to improve the research, how to improve the theory, and then data quality, how to improve the data quality, and how to improve data analysis. So these are the four major components that I'll be talking about, and that will be followed by hypothesis. What is hypothesis and how to frame the hypothesis? And I'll also give you some of the examples on hypothesis from social sciences. So now let's begin with framing the research question. The first thing that that you need to ask yourself, that what kind of research question I need to frame. So there are no scientific way to tell you what are the best ways to frame the research question, and that depends on your previous experience, previous knowledge, etc. But there are certain guidelines which will help you frame a critical research question. The first guideline would be that frame a question which is socially relevant. So if you are from social science background, so you should ask a question which is broadly related to the society. Second, ask a novel question for which no systematic study has been conducted. If you are interested in something and if you think that nobody has done research on that, so in that case what you can do is ask a question where nobody has done any systematic study. Third point, ask a question which challenges the established notion, because we all are social scientists, and the purpose here, or purpose of social science, is basically to create rival theory, rival hypothesis, to ask critical questions. So you have to ask question, you have to question something which is considered established in the literature, but you doubt something which is considered established in the literature. So challenging the established notion is an important part is the way that you should think of when you're framing the research question. Ask a question if you suspect that the available answers are false. If you think that some of the people have already done researches on a particular topic, but you're not satisfied, you're not happy, and you think that the kind of explanations which have been given by the previous scholars are not true, and you do not agree with them, so then you should ask a question which actually challenges that falsehood or falsehood of that particular theory or explanation. A question would be useful if it provides more information to the existing controversies that are there in the literature. Many times in social sciences, that there is a contest between the Marxist scholars, the liberalist scholars, and the postmodernist scholars. So even if you're providing some more evidence to one particular group, so that would be considered an important innovation, important contribution to the research. Again, one important point would be extrapolation of method or approach from one discipline to other. Many times what happens that you come from economics background, or you have some training in economics background, and you believe that the kind of methods which have been used in that particular discipline, or the kind of theory or approaches which have been used in economics could be useful for your discipline of political science or sociology. So there is no harm in borrowing that particular method to understand your own area of research. That is considered actually an important contribution to the literature. So these are the broader way or guidelines for framing a critical research question. Now, how do you improve the theory? You know very well the purpose of any theory is to explain and predict. Explanation and prediction are two important aspects of any theory. Here, what you need to remember, as Popper will tell you, the famous philosopher Karl Popper, that you have to frame theories which are falsifiable. Falsifiability would mean that you have to give the statement in a way so that your theories remain falsifiable. Let me give you an example. There are two examples here. One, somebody is saying, or a scientist is saying that it's going to rain, and the second scientist is saying that it's going to rain tomorrow. So just two statements which are very similar in nature, which appears very similar to an ordinary person, but if you see it very closely, one statement is falsifiable, the other statement is not falsifiable. The statement that is going to rain tomorrow is a statement which can be falsified. If it did not rain tomorrow, you can say that you said it is going to rain tomorrow, it did not rain, so you need to reject the theory or reject the statement that you're making. But if somebody had said that it's going to rain, so that statement is not falsifiable, because if that person did not say that it's going to rain tomorrow or day after tomorrow, so you can never falsify that kind of statement. So what I'm trying to tell you here, that falsifiability is an important part of any scientific theory. Your theory would not be considered scientific if your theory is not falsifiable, and this falsifiability has come from the famous philosopher called Karl Popper, who questioned the verification principle of the Vienna Circle, etc. I'm not getting to the detail, but just remember for the time being that falsifiability is an important part of any scientific theory. So make or construct a theory which is falsifiable. That's important criteria for giving any scientific theory. Now, the third point that you should remember, that in a state of limiting the scope of the theory, try to give a theory which has as many observable implications as possible. Your theory would be considered better if it explains, if it covers more data, or if it explains more observations. So there are two parts of it. If it explains more cases, which means your theory is also risky. Your theory is also much more falsifiable, because if you have more data, the chances of falsifiability will increase. At the same time, if you have more observation, that means your theory will have broader application. And best of the theories are actually universal in nature, and they are generalizable, and they basically apply to all the cases in the universe. For instance, when Einstein's theory of relativity, or Newton's theory when he gave the theory on gravity, etc. So those theories were applied. They had universal application. They had transcendental application. They were not confined to any particular region. Let me give you an example from social science. For instance, if you say that the democracies do not fight, so that's one theory, and the second theory could be that democracies in the developed countries do not fight. So there are two theories. One, democracies do not fight. That theory has universal application, but democracies in the developed countries do not fight. That has very limited application. So what I'm trying to tell you, that you should try to give theories which have universal application, rather than trying to limit the theory in terms of its space or in terms of its domain, etc. So don't try to limit the theory. Try to have a theory which have broader application, which have universal application, or even which have as broader as possible. Internal logical consistency, that's a requirement of any theory, that if your theory is not internally logically consistent, then that theory will not be accepted. Now, you also need to compare your theory with the existing theories which are there in the literature. Now, the point is, how do you know that which theory is better? You have theory A on the one hand, you have theory B on the other. So your theory B, which you are giving, would be considered better than theory A, which is already there by somebody else, if your theory explains more data, or if your theory is more falsifiable. So these are the two elements that you need to remember when you're trying to judge the theory, which theory is better. So every theory explains, so theory will explain. That's the basic purpose of any theory. But a theory would be considered better if it covers more data, and it is more falsifiable because of that. So these two things you need to remember while giving a theory. Now, with the theory, the hypothesis comes into my mind, that you need to frame hypothesis, and with the help of hypothesis, you break the theory actually into hypothesis. You derive hypothesis from the theories that you have. So what you do while framing hypothesis, basically you identify the variables. You explained in the previous lecture what is independent variable, what is dependent variable. So please identify the variables, independent variable and the dependent variables. Hypothesis is nothing but a kind of testable, speculative statement between the variables. And you can have three types of hypothesis. One is a simple testable statement. The second hypothesis can be causal hypothesis, where you're trying to find the correlation between the independent variable and the dependent variable. The third can be comparative hypothesis, and I'll give you an example of each hypothesis. You can have a simple hypothesis. You want to test, for instance, if you claim that the country's GDP is growing by 6.7%. India's GDP is growing by 6.7%. So you can actually check whether India's GDP is growing by that percentage or not. When you have the comparative hypothesis, then what you need to do, that you need to compare two hypotheses, where for instance, you want to compare the education level of child in one school with the education level of child in other school, or you want to compare the violence in one society with the violence in other society. If you say that the Indian society is less violent than the other societies in South Asia, so basically you're trying to compare here. For instance, if you say that the GDP of India is growing faster than the GDP of China, so then you are framing a hypothesis which is comparative in nature, and this is a testable statement, and it can be tested also, and it also explains and it helps you in supporting your theory through hypothesis. So hypothesis can be comparative in nature. Hypothesis can be causal in nature. If you say, for instance, this particular drug is if, for instance, the example that I gave you earlier, that if you apply fertilizer in a plot, the productivity increases by this percentage. So that is another kind of hypothesis where the relationship is causal in nature. You try to find out the causes. You find out the relationship between the causes and the effect. So that is a causal hypothesis. And when you try to explain something, causal hypothesis would be very, very necessary. And for theories, causal hypotheses are a very important part of any theoretical process. Now let me give you this some of the times you might have encountered what is a null hypothesis, sometimes null and alternative hypothesis. So a hypothesis, null hypothesis, basically is put forward to argue that a relationship or pattern does not exist. A hypothesis put forward to argue that a relationship or pattern does not exist. For instance, group A and group B are equal. Thus, the sign is HO, the subscript. The alternative hypothesis, statement of what a study is said to establish. Example of alternative hypothesis would be group A and B have different levels of cholesterol. So you have the null hypothesis, group A and B have equal level of cholesterol, and here you have alternative hypothesis, which tells you, it shows the difference between the two groups that you are trying to compare. So the null hypothesis will be true if the findings are insignificant. The null hypothesis will be false if the findings are significant. Now, more than the null and alternative hypothesis, what is necessary for you to understand? So what are the hypotheses which have been given by, say, social scientists in the literature? Here I give you the example of few hypotheses. If you see the slide here, here there is one hypothesis given by James Ferron and David Latin in American Political Science Review, and it is there in February 2003 American Political Science Review, that journal. There they have framed the hypothesis that countries with an ethnic majority and a significant ethnic minority are at a greater risk of civil war. A second hypothesis, which is very interesting, given by this Huntington, that it is my hypothesis that the fundamental source of conflict in this new world will be primarily ideological or primarily economic. The great divisions among humankind and the dominating source of conflict will be cultural. Nation states will remain the most powerful actors in the world, but the principal conflicts of global conflict will occur between nations and groups of different civilizations. And here he talks of class of civilization, and similarly he has given you a hypothesis on how the civilizations will, and the conflict between the civilizations will take place. The third, the class of civilization will dominate the global politics. The fault lines between civilizations will be the battle lines of the future. That is the continuation of the same hypothesis. And now let me give you a hypothesis by Durkheim. Durkheim, here you have the hypothesis like suicide rate would vary by religion, in parenthesis Protestant, Catholic, Jews, by marital status, by military status, and by economic condition. So these are the variables which will explain this, which actually he is trying to understand the rate of suicide with the help of variables like religion, military status, marital status, and economic condition. So this is how when you try to explain something, you use causal variables to frame the hypothesis. For another hypothesis by Karl Marx, for instance, socialist revolution will happen first in England because of the industrialization and the emergence of two antagonistic classes. So here there is an example of another hypothesis given by Karl Marx, that socialist revolution will happen first in England because of the industrialization and the emergence of two antagonistic classes, and he was referring to the bourgeois class and the proletariat class. So he is trying to formulate the hypothesis for the class struggle that he was trying to explain in the industrialized country like England. So now this will give you an idea that how should you frame your hypothesis. You have broadly understood what is hypothesis and what are the ways you can formulate hypothesis, and hypothesis will help you understand the theories that you have given for your research. So here now I am coming to the data, the data and the quality of data. When you talk of the data, two things that come into your mind, that you primary data and the secondary data. If you're collecting your data from the field, that data would be primary. But if you are taking the data from from some other sources. For instance, if you're taking the data from one of the organizations or one of the some of the websites, etc. So that data would be secondary, or the books and the articles which have been written, all that would be secondary literature, or that would constitute the secondary data. Yes, primary data, again, we should consult some of the university. There are certain here disputes or some kind of debates on what is primary data, what is secondary data. What I've seen in India, for instance, the government websites in one of the institutes are considered primary data, but when you go to the other department, they'll consider even the government data or the World Bank data to be the secondary data. So there are certain kind of disagreements on what should be the primary data. But here, what definitely there is no confusion is if you collect the data yourself from the field or from the subject, then your data is definitely primary. There is no doubt on that, and all the scholars agree on that particular aspect of data. Now, data again can be qualitative or quantitative. I have already told you about that. And now, what are the methods that we collect the data? We conduct some experiment, and that is one method of collecting the data in biology, in natural sciences, and also sometimes in psychology and some of the social sciences. We do have the experimental method where you have the control variables, where you control the variables and then try to see the impact of one particular variable. Experimental method of analysis is popular in some of the disciplines of social science, but many times your observation would be indirect. For instance, if you are doing historical research, then you might want to go into the archives and you try to get facts or you try to get data from either archives or institutional data sets. Some of the institutions like World Bank, United Nations, or the government data set, the government of India, all of them do collect data, and that data can be used for your research. And if you're planning to do a survey, then you have to visit the field, you have to do the field work, you have to frame the questionnaire. You can have a structured questionnaire format, or you may have unstructured format. That again will depend upon the kind of research that you're planning to do. So you can collect the data actually through the survey, through a structured or non-structured questionnaire format. Data quality here, what you should remember, that when you're trying to collect the data, your data would depend upon ask what data is needed to answer the research question that you have formulated, or hypothesis that you have formulated. The immediate question that should come to your mind would be, what data do I need to answer the research question, and what data do I need to support my hypothesis? So that should constitute what data do you actually need. A second important point would be, check the validity of data. By validity, what I mean is the measurement, and how you measure the data. So that tells you whether your data is actually that data is actually valid or not. For instance, a very simple example, you cannot measure water by thermometer, for instance, right? If you want to measure water, it has to be liter. Only then you can measure. So the measuring instrument should be standard. Similarly, I'll give you an example of social science. If you want to measure the growth of a country, the GDP of a country, you cannot simply measure the GDP of a country by, say, for instance, the rate of unemployment. Although this is also an indicator of broader growth, but you cannot measure the GDP of a country just by unemployment. So what you need to do if you want to measure the concept of GDP or the growth rate of a country, so you have to see the growth in the industrial sector, growth in agriculture sector, and growth in the service and tertiary sector. So that's how you need to measure the GDP. But if you try to measure just through the employment and unemployment, so that measurement will not be considered valid. Again, if you want to measure, say, democracy of a country, you should try to measure the democracy of a country by, say, the political parties, the contest of the political parties, parliamentary process, the freedom of media, the freedom of expression of the people, the freedom to organize, etc. So, how vibrant the civil society, how vibrant the media is. So, these are the instruments through which you measure the broader concept like democracy. So, your measurement has to be valid. You cannot measure just the democracy of a country just by the existence of political parties. Even if there are certain political parties existing in the country, it does not mean that country becomes democratic, because unless and until there is free and fair election, unless until there is a very fierce competition between the political parties, unless until the media is free, unless until the civil societies are vibrant, you cannot actually measure the democracy. So your validity here would mean that the measurement technique that you apply, that should be valid. The second point is reliability. This, in simple word, what it means is that if you follow a certain procedure and you come to a certain outcome, so if somebody else is also following the same procedure and somebody else is not coming to the same outcome, that means your research is not reliable. Same procedure, same outcome, so that would mean that your data is reliable. So if you have followed certain process of research and you have come to a certain conclusion, the other person who is following and who is using the same data and same procedure should come to the same conclusion. So that means your research is reliable. Now one thing that you need to remember, that when you're collecting the data, your procedure of collecting the data and reporting the data, you should report that how did you collect the data, and so there has to be transparency in terms of collecting the data and also reporting the data. So that transparency, your research actually, this is called that your data should be public, which means that if somebody else wants to access the data, then it has to be, that person should also be, that data should be available to the other person also. But many times, I've seen that in United States and all, they collect the data, they create the data set. The data is not necessarily available unless until you pay something to buy the data set. So these are the ways, but the fact is that they do make it public. Of course, the charges, but they do make it public. So your data should be public. And while collecting the data, please collect data on as many variables as possible. So, you have certain variables in mind, but if there are certain variables, so please try to collect data on as many variables as you can. Now finally, what comes is analysis of data. Your data analysis can be qualitative or quantitative. In the qualitative, you have the case study, historical, discourse-based research. In quantitative, you have a statistical and sometimes experimental method of doing research. Qualitative data would be, analysis of data would be narrative style of description, historical or process tracing, or the case study method. And case study method is, by and large qualitative, but sometimes case study method can also be quantitative. So what you need to do, that you need to master one of the techniques at least to understand, if you want to design your research in a particular way. So I'll suggest you learn either historical method or narrative style of description, or even case study method. So you master one of the techniques if you're planning to do qualitative analysis of data. If you're planning to do quantitative analysis of data, then statistics would be a very useful tool for you to understand how to collect the data, how to summarize the data, and how to analyze the data. What would be needed for quantitative research is your knowledge of statistics, which means measures of central tendencies like mean, median, mode. Then you have to learn probability. You have to learn confidence interval, correlation, regression, etc. And after that, you also need to understand need to learn the softwares like SPSS or Stata or any other software that are used to analyze the data. Here, in measuring the central tendency through mean, median, mode, capturing the variation and covariation through a standard deviation or correlation, and this causation through regression, which can be simple or multiple regression, and related concepts such as confidence interval, hypothesis testing, regression, etc. Then G-value and T-test and P-value, etc. That you need to understand apart from the software like SPSS or Stata or SAS. Now this is a small example. This chart gives you this example of how simple regression is done, where you on the x-axis you have the height in inches, and on y-axis, which is vertical. So here you have the body weight. So it tries to understand the relationship between, as the height increases, how the weight of a person increases. So the relationship between height and weight through simple regression. And here there is further, there are error terms, because regression, it takes the middle line, and then you have a distance between the case and the actual average regression line. So here tells you what is error, etc. This is the formula of regression. I'm not getting into detail here because unless until you master the technique, it may not be possible to understand all of that. y hat is equal to a plus bx plus e, which is the error term, etc. When we talk about the quantitative method, probably I'll explain you what is regression, simple regression, multiple regression. But for the time being, I'm just showing you some of the statistical techniques which are used in social sciences. Now, correlation and causation. Here also you need to understand correlation is not causation. Spurious causes spurious causation is an issue. Causation is a theoretical and commonsensical process, and not every correlation is causation. And finally, what you need to know, that you need to minimize the biases. You need to understand like problem of endogeneity, selection bias, multicollinearity, omitted variable bias, and ethnocentricity. This I will cover in other lecture, because you need time for this. But for the time being, I'll stop it here. And in case you have any clarifications and questions, you please feel free to ask me. With this, I come to the conclusion of my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us this productive session. Friends, if you wish to give a feedback on this particular lecture, then do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. We would be meeting again very soon and would be discussing more. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.